The objective of this lesson is to multiply a fraction by a whole number in a word problem and specify which two whole numbers the answer is between. In previous lessons, students practiced multiplying fractions by a whole number using a variety of visual models. In this lesson, we will read and make sense of a word problem in which a fraction is multiplied by a whole number, then calculate the product using a visual model. Let's begin with the following problem. Your uncle agreed to help you make his famous Morning Glory muffins for your whole class. There are 30 students in your room. The recipe makes just 1 dozen muffins. You and your uncle decide that extras to give to the office staff would be nice. How many batches will you need to make to have enough muffins? In this situation, we need to make at least 3 batches. 3 batches of 12 muffins each would give us 36 muffins, which would provide enough for the whole class and several left over for the office staff. We must now determine the correct amount of each needed ingredient to prepare 3 batches of muffins. The recipe for Morning Glory muffins is shown. Since we will be making 3 batches of muffins, we will need 3 groups of each type of ingredient. 3 groups of 1/2 cups of raisins, 3 groups of 2 cups of flour, 3 groups of 1 cup of brown sugar, and so on. Our equations will be written as a multiplication equation. 3 multiplied by 1/2 cups, 3 multiplied by 2 cups, 3 multiplied by 1 cup, and so on. As we examine the recipe further, notice a number of ingredients that call for the same amount. For example, raisins, shredded coconut, and chopped walnuts are all needed in a quantity of 1/2 cup. This means we only need to solve the equation for the total amount of raisins, and then we can use the same calculations for shredded coconut and chopped walnuts. Similarly, both ground ginger and salt require 1/2 teaspoon. We can again borrow from the calculation for raisins and simply change the unit of measure from cups to teaspoons to arrive at the amount of ground ginger and salt needed without solving the same equation twice. The first ingredient in the recipe calls for 1/2 cup of raisins. Our equation is 3 multiplied by 1/2 cups, or 3 groups of 1/2. We can visualize this several ways. 3 groups of 1/2 is equal to 3 halves, or 1 1/2. Looking at the visual representation, we can see that the product is more than 1 and less than 2. This means that the product lies between 1 and 2. The next several ingredients call for whole numbers of each measurement. Multiplying these is simple. The next fractional ingredients are ground ginger and salt. Since both of these measure 1/2 teaspoons, we can use the equation for raisins as our guide. 3 multiplied by 1/2 teaspoons is equal to 3 halves teaspoons, or 1 1/2 teaspoons. Again, the product lies between the whole numbers 1 and 2. Sunflower seeds are the next equation we need to solve. Those we are skipping have already been solved with an equation for another ingredient, or only include multiplying whole numbers together. The recipe calls for 1/3 cup of sunflower seeds. The equation for 3 batches is 3 multiplied by 1/3 cup, or 3 groups of 1/3, which equals 1 whole. To check our answer, we can use a repeated addition equation. 1/3 cup plus 1/3 cup plus 1/3 cup equals 3/3 cups, which is the same as 1 whole. Next, the recipe asks for 2/3 cup of vegetable oil. 3 multiplied by 2/3 is the same as 3 multiplied by 2, both of which are 1/3 in size. This means the product is 6 1/3 sized pieces, or 6/3 cups, which is equivalent to 2 whole cups. The final ingredient is 1/4 cup of orange juice. 3 multiplied by 1/4 is the same as 3 groups of the unit fraction 1/4, or 3/4. We need 3/4 of a cup of orange juice to make 3 batches of muffins. While it is sometimes easier to solve equations with a product in fractional form, it is also important to specify the equivalent mixed number of the product. For example, it is far simpler at the store to purchase 3 1/2 pounds of apples than it is to purchase 7/2 pounds of apples. That is why our products are stated as both fractions and mixed numbers. In our next story problem, Kim is making 3 pillowcases. Each pillowcase requires 1 1/2 yards of fabric. How much fabric does she need? To solve this, our equation would be 3 multiplied by 1 1/2 yards. We could rewrite the mixed number into a fraction to make the multiplication easier. 3 multiplied by 3 halves would be 9 halves. We can then change our product back into a mixed number, 4 1/2. she needs 4 1/2 yards of fabric. Alternatively, we could identify two separate multiplication calculations, 3 multiplied by 1 yard and 3 multiplied by 1/2 yard. Solving each expression separately, we arrive at 3 yards and 3 1/2 yards. Then, we will add these terms together for a sum of 3 3/2 yards, or 4 1/2 yards. Kim needs 4 1/2 yards of fabric for her pillowcases. The objective for this lesson was to multiply a fraction by a whole number in a word problem. We met this objective by making sense of a word problem to identify the number of groups and the fraction factor of each equation. We also looked at visual models to represent the equations and provided products as both fractions and mixed numbers. As needed, we checked our answers using repeated addition.